February 1st, 1942. A burning Japanese bomber is diving straight at the USS Enterprise. Every gun on the ship is firing. Nothing is stopping it. In exactly 8 seconds, that aircraft will slam into the flight deck, and America's most valuable warship will explode into flames. And then one man does something insane. A 25-year-old machinist named Bruno Gaido sprints toward the kamikaze. He climbs into a parked dive bomber loaded with fuel and live bombs. He grabs the twin machine guns, and he opens fire at point-blank range. What happens next saved 2,000 American lives and changed the course of World War II. But here is what nobody tells you. Bruno Gaido was not a pilot. He was not a gunner. He was not even supposed to be there. He was just a mechanic who fixed airplane engines. And his so-called suicidal decision? Military experts called it the single bravest act of individual courage in the entire Pacific War. This is the story of how one ordinary man, with no special training and no orders from anyone, saved the most important aircraft carrier in the American fleet. The world on fire. To understand why Bruno Gaido's action mattered, you need to understand how desperate America was in early 1942. 8 weeks earlier, on December 7, 1941, Japan had launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In less than 2 hours, they destroyed 188 American aircraft. They sank or damaged 21 ships. They killed 2,403 Americans. The mighty Pacific Fleet, which had taken decades to build, was reduced to twisted metal and burning oil. The battleships that were supposed to protect America lay broken on the harbor floor. The Arizona was still burning. The Oklahoma had capsized completely. Sailors who had been sleeping peacefully that Sunday morning were now trapped inside steel tombs at the bottom of the harbor. America was in shock. The country had been attacked on its own soil for the first time since the War of 1812, and Japan was not stopping. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military machine rolled across the Pacific like an unstoppable wave. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Philippines were under siege. Hong Kong surrendered. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, was about to collapse. The Japanese Navy seemed invincible. Their Zero fighters could outmaneuver anything the Americans had. Their torpedo bombers had just proven they could destroy an entire fleet in one morning. Their pilots were battle-hardened veterans who had been fighting in China for years. And here was America's problem. After Pearl Harbor, the United States had only 3 operational aircraft carriers in the entire Pacific Ocean. 3. Against the Japanese Empire's 10 carriers and hundreds of land-based aircraft. If America lost even one of those 3 carriers, the balance of power would shift catastrophically. Japan could cut off Australia. They could threaten Hawaii itself. They could potentially strike the American mainland. The USS Enterprise was the most important of those 3 carriers. She was fast. She was well-trained. Her air group was the best in the fleet. Losing the Enterprise would be like losing a limb. And on February 1st, 1942, the Enterprise was running for her life. The man nobody noticed. Bruno Peter Gaido was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to an Italian immigrant family. His father, John, worked hard to provide for his children. His mother, Clementina, kept the household running. They were not rich, they were not connected. They were just ordinary working-class people trying to survive the Great Depression. When Bruno turned 18, he wanted to join the Navy immediately. The military offered something rare in 1934: steady pay 3 meals a day, and purpose. For a young man from a struggling family, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. But his father said no. John Gaido had seen what military service could do to a man. He thought his son was too young. He wanted Bruno to wait, to grow up a little more, to be certain about such a serious decision. So Bruno waited. For 6 years. He bounced between odd jobs. He worked on farms. He worked in a brewery. He watched the news from Europe and Asia grow darker month after month. Germany was rearming. Japan was on the march. War clouds were gathering. By 1940, even his cautious father knew what was coming. He finally relented. In October of that year, Bruno Gaido enlisted in the United States Navy at the age of 24. After boot camp, Gaido was assigned to Naval Air Station Pearl Harbor. There he trained as an aviation machinist, learning to maintain the complex engines that kept Navy aircraft in the sky. He was good at it. Really good. He had a natural feel for machines, an instinct for what was wrong and how to fix it. In July 1941, he was temporarily assigned to Scouting Squadron 6, which flew from the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. The assignment was supposed to be short, just long enough to learn the basics of carrier aviation. But Bruno Gaido had a way of making himself indispensable. The dive bomber he worked on was the Douglas SBD Dauntless. It was a 2-seat aircraft. The pilot sat up front, controlling the plane during its near-vertical attacks on enemy ships. The radio man gunner sat in the rear, operating communications and manning twin 30-caliber machine guns for defense against enemy fighters. As a machinist, Gaido's job was to keep the planes flying. But he also qualified as a rear-seat gunner. And he quickly developed a reputation for something the Navy valued above almost everything else: toughness. The legend begins. Before Bruno Gaido became famous for fighting a kamikaze, he was already a legend among the Enterprise Air Group for something else entirely. In June 1941, a newly reported pilot named Lieutenant Norman Kleiss climbed into his SBD Dauntless to make his first carrier landing. This was one of the most dangerous maneuvers in naval aviation. You had to drop a heavy aircraft onto a pitching deck barely 800 feet long. You had to catch one of the arresting wires with your tailhook while approaching at over 70 miles per hour. One mistake, and you could go over the side, slam into the crash barrier, or spin off the deck into the ocean. Standard procedure for qualification flights was to fly solo with sandbags in the rear seat. The sandbags simulated the weight of a gunner. That way, if something went wrong, only one man would die instead of 2. When Kleiss climbed into his cockpit, he expected to find sandbags. Instead, he found Bruno Gaido. Gaido was already strapped in, manning the rear guns, a slight grin on his face. "What the hell are you doing here?" Kleiss demanded. "This is my qual flight. Get out." Gaido did not move. "You got wings, don't you?" he said. Kleiss tried to argue. He tried to explain the danger. He tried to order Gaido out of the aircraft. But the machinist just sat there, completely calm, completely confident, waiting for the pilot to stop talking and start flying. That moment changed everything for Norman Kleiss. He would later say that Gaido's confidence transformed his own mindset. If this machinist believed in him enough to risk his life on a qualification flight, then maybe Kleiss could believe in himself too. He made 6 perfect landings that day. Dusty Kleiss would go on to become one of the most decorated dive bomber pilots of World War II. He was the only pilot to score direct hits on 3 different Japanese ships at the Battle of Midway, all of which sank. He received the Navy Cross. He lived to be 100 years old. But he never forgot the machinist who believed in him when it mattered most. December 7th, 1941. On the morning of the Pearl Harbor attack, Bruno Gaido was not at Pearl Harbor. He was 200 miles away, aboard the USS Enterprise, returning from a mission to deliver Marine fighter planes to Wake Island. The carrier had been scheduled to arrive in Pearl Harbor on December 6th, but heavy weather had delayed her by 1 day. That single day of delay saved the Enterprise and possibly changed the course of the entire war. When news of the attack reached the Big E, her aircraft launched immediately, searching for the Japanese fleet. They did not find it. The 6 Japanese carriers had already disappeared into the vast Pacific, leaving behind the burning wreckage of Battleship Row. Some Enterprise scout planes arrived over Pearl Harbor during the attack itself. Several were shot down, some by Japanese Zeros, others by friendly fire from panicked American gunners who shot at anything in the sky. That evening, the Enterprise crept into Pearl Harbor in complete darkness. Her crew saw what the Japanese had done. The Arizona still burning. The Oklahoma capsized. The fleet they had trained with for years reduced to twisted steel and floating oil. "Where in hell were you?" angry voices called from the docks. "You better get the hell out of here before the Japs come back and nail you too." They refueled in the shadow of burning ships, working through the night. By 600 the next morning, Enterprise had cleared the harbor channel and returned to the vast Pacific. America was at war, and the Enterprise, one of only 3 operational carriers left, was the tip of the American spear. The first strike back. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew he could not change the whole war overnight, but he could hit back, if only to show America it could still fight. On January 11th, 1942, Enterprise departed Pearl Harbor as part of Task Force 8 under Vice Admiral William Halsey. Bull Halsey was one of the most aggressive naval commanders in American history. He did not believe in playing defense. Their target was the Marshall Islands, where Japan had established air and naval bases that threatened American shipping lanes. The raid was scheduled for February 1st, 1942, a Sunday, just like Pearl Harbor. It would be America's first offensive action of the Pacific War. The raid began before dawn. Enterprise launched 36 SBD Dauntless dive bombers against Japanese positions. The attacks caught the enemy by surprise. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Ships were sunk in the harbors. Shore installations were wrecked. It was payback. Small payback, but payback nonetheless. And then the Japanese struck back. At approximately 1:40 p.m., as Enterprise retired from the area at high speed, 5 Mitsubishi G3M MEL bombers found her. They had tracked the American carrier through a combination of luck and determination. The bombers approached from the starboard bow at 10,000 feet. Every anti-aircraft battery on Enterprise opened up, throwing a curtain of steel into the sky. F-4F Wildcat fighters from the Combat Air Patrol dove on the attackers. The Japanese went into shallow power dives. Each bomber dropped 3 bombs. Captain George Murray threw the Enterprise into hard maneuvers. All 15 bombs missed. The nearest splashed into the water about 50 feet off the port quarter. 4 of the bombers turned for home. The 5th did not. The kamikaze. Lieutenant Kazuo Nakai's bomber was finished. Wildcat fighters had riddled it during the approach. Flames were streaming from the engines. The plane was dying, and Nakai knew he would die with it. So he made a choice that would not become common for another 2.5 years. Instead of trying to nurse his crippled aircraft back to base, a journey he would never complete, Nakai turned sharply and aimed his burning bomber directly at the Enterprise. The term kamikaze would not be coined until 1944, when Japan made suicide attacks official policy. But Lieutenant Kazuo Nakai, in the first weeks of the war, had independently arrived at the same conclusion that would later consume an entire generation of Japanese pilots. If he was going to die anyway, he would take as many Americans with him as possible. On the Enterprise, every gun that could bear opened fire. Tracers streaked toward the approaching plane. Shells burst around it. But the bomber kept coming. Lower now, flames streaming, guns still firing. The anti-aircraft fire was not stopping it. From his position in the catwalk, Bruno Gaido watched the bomber grow larger with each passing second. He could see the flames licking from the engine cowling. He could see the Japanese pilot through the cockpit glass. He had maybe 8 seconds to act. And Bruno Gaido did the only thing he could think of. He ran. Not away from the danger, toward it. Bruno Gaido sprinted across the open flight deck, directly into the path of the incoming kamikaze. He scrambled into the rear seat of a parked SBD Dauntless dive bomber, Aircraft 6S5. His normal position when this plane was airborne. But right now, it was just a parked aircraft, with a tank full of aviation fuel, and live bombs still mounted under its wings. If the Japanese bomber hit the flight deck, this aircraft would explode. Gaido knew this. He did not care. He grabbed the twin .30 caliber machine guns. He swiveled them toward the approaching inferno, and he opened fire. What happened in the next 3 seconds would become one of the most extraordinary acts of individual bravery in naval aviation history. Witnesses would describe it as a personal duel. The Japanese pilot versus the American machinist, trading fire in the final moments before impact. Did Bruno Gaido actually stop the kamikaze? Did his bullets find their mark? And what price would he pay for this moment of insane courage? In Part 2, we will see the incredible aftermath of Bruno Gaido's decision. We will watch as Admiral Halsey promotes him on the spot. We will follow him to the Battle of Midway, where he helps sink a Japanese carrier. And we will learn the heartbreaking truth about what happened when the Japanese finally captured the machinist who had defied death itself. Bruno Gaido's story was only beginning. Part 1. You watched a 25-year-old machinist named Bruno Gaido sprint across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise toward a burning Japanese bomber. You saw him climb into a parked dive bomber loaded with fuel and live bombs. You saw him grab the twin machine guns and aim them at an incoming kamikaze. Now you will see what happened in the next 3 seconds. But here is what makes this story insane. Bruno Gaido was not supposed to be in that aircraft. He was not supposed to leave his battle station. He was not supposed to act without orders. In the pre-war Navy, what he did could have gotten him court-martialed. He did it anyway. And what happened next would turn a nobody machinist into one of the most celebrated heroes of the Pacific War. It would earn him a battlefield promotion that normally takes years, and it would set him on a path toward the Battle of Midway, where his story would take a turn that nobody saw coming. This is where everything changes. The 3-second duel. Bruno Gaido stood in the rear seat of Aircraft 6S5. His hands gripped the twin .30 caliber machine guns. The Japanese bomber filled his entire field of vision. Flames poured from its engines. Smoke trailed behind it like a death shroud. He could see the pilot through the cockpit glass. Lieutenant Kazuo Nakai was aiming directly at him. Gaido pulled the trigger. Tracers erupted from his guns. The muzzle flash lit up the flight deck. Brass shell casings flew through the air. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar that drowned out everything else. The Japanese bomber kept coming. Gaido adjusted his aim. He depressed the guns, pointing them down into the approaching aircraft. At this angle, his bullets were tearing directly into the cockpit, into the pilot, into whatever was keeping that burning wreck in the air. Admiral William Halsey watched from the bridge. He would later describe what he saw as a personal duel. One man against one aircraft, point-blank range, neither willing to back down. 3 seconds felt like 3 hours. And then something happened. Captain George Murray had ordered a hard turn to starboard. The entire ship heeled over. The flight deck tilted beneath Gaido's feet. He kept firing. The combination of the ship's maneuver and Gaido's bullets pouring into the cockpit caused the bomber to lose control at the last possible moment. Instead of slamming into the center of the flight deck, the Nell's right wing clipped the tail of Gaido's dive bomber. The impact was catastrophic. The tail of aircraft 6S5 sheared clean off. 3 feet from where Bruno Gaido was still standing, still firing. The wrecked Dauntless spun toward the edge of the flight deck. The Japanese bomber's wings separated from the fuselage and skidded across the deck, spraying aviation fuel everywhere. Lieutenant Nakai's aircraft, finally finished, plunged into the sea off the port quarter and disappeared beneath the waves. But Bruno Gaido was not finished. The man who would not stop. The tail of his aircraft was gone. The plane was teetering on the edge of the flight deck. Aviation fuel from the Japanese bomber was burning in pools across the deck. Any second, the whole thing could explode. Gaido kept firing. He poured rounds into the wreckage of the bomber as it settled into the sea. He did not stop until there was nothing left to shoot at. Then he grabbed the fire extinguisher from inside the SBD cockpit. He climbed out of the shattered aircraft, and he started putting out the burning fuel that the Japanese plane had left behind. Only when the fires were out did Bruno Gaido stop. And then he did something that was completely in character. He disappeared. The hunt. As soon as the immediate crisis was over, Bruno Gaido slipped into the ship's interior. He vanished into the maze of compartments and passageways that made up the Enterprise's lower decks. He was not looking for congratulations. He was hiding. Gaido was convinced he was going to be in serious trouble. He had abandoned his assigned battle station without permission. He had climbed into an aircraft without orders. He had done exactly what a good sailor was never supposed to do. He had acted on his own initiative. In the peacetime Navy, that kind of thing could end your career. It could get you court-martialed. It could send you to the brig. Bruno Gaido had just saved the ship, and he thought he was about to be punished for it. But Vice Admiral William Halsey was not a peacetime admiral. Bull Halsey had watched the entire incident from the bridge. He had seen the machinist run across the deck. He had seen him climb into the parked aircraft. He had seen him pour fire into the approaching bomber while the tail of his own plane was being ripped apart 3 feet behind him. He had seen the young man calmly extinguish the fires and then vanish into the ship. "Who was that man?" Halsey demanded. No one on the bridge knew. "Find him," Halsey ordered, "and bring him to me." Face to face with the Admiral. A search party was dispatched into the ship. It took them almost an hour to find Gaido. He had hidden himself well, deep in the engineering spaces where few officers ever went. When they finally tracked him down, Gaido was certain his career was over. He followed the search party to the bridge, expecting to face a court-martial board. Instead, he found himself standing at attention before Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, one of the most powerful men in the United States Navy. Halsey looked at the young machinist, 25 years old, covered in soot and sweat, still wearing his work clothes. No pilot wings on his chest, no special insignia, just an ordinary enlisted man who had done something extraordinary. "Do you know what you just did?" Halsey asked. Gaido swallowed hard. "Sir, I left my battle station without permission. Halsey held up his hand. "You just saved my ship," the admiral said. "And you probably saved 2,000 lives." The flight deck of the Enterprise was packed with aircraft, fuel, and ammunition. If that Japanese bomber had crashed into it, the resulting explosion and fire could have been catastrophic. The Big E might have been lost. America would have been down to just 2 carriers in the Pacific. The war could have taken a very different turn. Halsey smiled. "Consider yourself promoted," he said. Right there on the bridge, without paperwork or formal ceremony, Bruno Gaido was advanced from Aviation Machinist's Mate 3rd Class to Aviation Machinist's Mate 1st Class. A promotion that normally takes years of service and multiple evaluations. Halsey did it with a handshake. The hero of the Enterprise. News of Gaido's actions spread through the ship like wildfire. Within hours, every man on the Enterprise knew the story of the machinist who had run toward the kamikaze. The tale grew with each telling. Some said Gaido had shot the pilot through the cockpit glass. Others said he had physically deflected the bomber with his gunfire. The details changed, but the core remained the same. One man had done something impossible, and he had saved them all. Bruno Gaido also received a commendation from Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox himself. The citation praised his extraordinary courage and disregard for his own safety. But Gaido being Gaido, he probably would have preferred to skip all the attention. He just wanted to get back to work. The wrecked SBD Dauntless, Aircraft 6S5, was pushed over the side of the ship. Its tail had been completely destroyed. The fuselage was riddled with holes from the impact. There was no saving it. But Bruno Gaido had saved everything else. The Enterprise strikes back. The months after the Marshall Islands raid were busy ones for the Enterprise and her crew. In late February, the Big E struck Wake Island, the same island where Marines had fought desperately before being overwhelmed by Japanese forces in December. In March, she attacked Marcus Island, just 1,000 miles from Tokyo itself. In April, she provided cover for the Doolittle raid. She escorted the USS Hornet close enough to Japan to launch 16 B-25 bombers against Tokyo. It was the first time American aircraft had struck the Japanese homeland. The raids did not change the strategic situation. Japan was still winning everywhere. But they proved that America could strike back. They proved that the Japanese were not invincible. And they made Bruno Gaido a minor celebrity among the Enterprise crew. Everyone on the ship knew his story. The machinist who had run toward the kamikaze. The enlisted man who had saved the admiral's ship. The guy who thought he was going to be court-martialed and got promoted instead. But Gaido did not let the attention change him. He continued his work as a machinist and gunner, flying missions whenever Scouting Squadron 6 needed him. His reputation for toughness only grew. Then came the moment that would define his legacy forever. Midway. In late May 1942, American codebreakers made a discovery that would change the course of the Pacific War. They had cracked the Japanese naval code, and they had learned Japan's next move. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was planning a massive strike against Midway Atoll, a tiny island roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. The attack would use the same 4 aircraft carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Yamamoto's plan was brilliant. He would destroy Midway's defenses, then use the island as a base to threaten Hawaii itself. And if the American carriers came out to defend Midway, he would destroy them too. The Japanese had 6 aircraft carriers available for the operation. The Americans had 3. But the Americans had one advantage Yamamoto did not know about. They knew he was coming. Admiral Chester Nimitz decided to gamble everything. He rushed Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown to a point northeast of Midway. They would hide there, waiting in ambush. On June 4th, 1942, the trap was sprung. The Morning of Fire. The morning of June 4th, 1942, began with disaster for the Americans. Wave after wave of American aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet. Torpedo bombers from all 3 carriers, Marine dive bombers from Midway itself, even Army B-17s flying at high altitude. Almost all of them were destroyed. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet was completely wiped out. 15 aircraft, 30 men. Only one survived. Ensign George Gay floated in the water, hiding under a seat cushion, watching the battle unfold around him. The sacrifice seemed pointless. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. But it was not pointless at all. The attacks by the torpedo bombers drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. The Zero fighters, the deadliest aircraft in the Pacific, were all at low altitude, slaughtering the slow torpedo planes. The sky above the Japanese carriers was empty. At 10:20 a.m., dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet at 20,000 feet. They looked down and saw something they could not believe. 4 Japanese carriers. Flight decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed. Bombs and torpedoes lay exposed. Aviation fuel lines snaked across the decks. And not a single fighter to stop them. The American pilots pushed over into their dives. Bruno Gaido's last mission. Bruno Gaido climbed into the rear seat of an SBD Dauntless that morning. His pilot was Ensign Frank Woodrow O'Flaherty, a young officer making his first combat dive. Their target was the carrier Kaga, one of the largest and most powerful warships in the Japanese Navy. She displaced over 42,000 tons. Her flight deck was 812 feet long. Her air group had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now she was about to die. Gaido felt the Dauntless pitch forward into a nearly vertical descent. The horizon tilted crazily. The ocean seemed to rush up toward them. He could not see forward. He was facing backward, scanning for Japanese fighters that never came. But he could feel the gravity pressing him into his seat as they plummeted toward the enemy carrier. At 1,500 feet, O'Flaherty released their 500-pound bomb. It was a near miss. The bomb exploded close to Kaga, but did not hit directly. But other pilots were more fortunate. 4 bombs struck Kaga's flight deck, detonating among the armed and fueled aircraft. The explosion set off a chain reaction. Fuel ignited. Bombs cooked off. Within seconds, the carrier was an inferno. In just 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were mortally wounded. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. All burning, all doomed. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, would be hit that afternoon. It was the most decisive naval victory in American history. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. But for Bruno Gaido, the battle was not over. The chase. After the attack on Kaga, O'Flaherty and Gaido joined a group of 6 SBDs led by Lieutenant Charles Ware. They were heading back toward the Enterprise. They were not alone. 6 Japanese Zero fighters from Hiryu spotted the small formation. The Zeros had been escorting a dive bomber strike against the USS Yorktown. But they could not resist the temptation of 6 slow, vulnerable dauntlesses. The fastest, most maneuverable fighters in the Pacific, against 6 lumbering dive bombers. It should have been a massacre. Lieutenant Ware had developed a defensive tactic for exactly this situation. As each Zero made a firing pass from behind, Ware would turn his formation toward the attacker. This created an arc that allowed all 6 rear gunners to concentrate their fire on the lead fighter. Bruno Gaido and the other gunners opened up. Tracers crisscrossed the sky. 2 of the Japanese fighters were so badly damaged they had to break off the attack. One ditched in the ocean on the way back to Hiryu. The other barely made it to the carrier. The 6 dauntlesses had fought off 6 Zeros, but the fight had taken its toll. O'Flaherty and Gaido's aircraft had been holed during either the bomb run or the dogfight. Fuel was streaming from the damaged tanks. The engine was drinking gas faster than it should. There was not enough fuel left to reach the Enterprise. Cliffhanger. O'Flaherty had no choice. As the other SBDs continued toward home, he put the Dauntless down in the open sea, about 20 miles from the burning Japanese carriers. The ditching was successful. O'Flaherty and Gaido scrambled out of the sinking aircraft. They inflated their life raft. James McCarthy, flying in another SBD, watched them climb into the raft and noted their position. Help would be sent. But help never came. Bruno Gaido had survived running toward a kamikaze. He had survived having the tail of his aircraft sheared off 3 feet behind him. He had survived diving on one of the most heavily defended ships in the Japanese Navy. He had survived a dogfight with 6 Zero fighters. Now he was floating in a tiny rubber raft, surrounded by the wreckage of the Japanese fleet he had helped destroy. And somewhere in that wreckage, a Japanese destroyer was hunting for survivors. In Part 3, you will learn what happened when the Japanese found Bruno Gaido. You will discover the terrible choice he faced as a prisoner of the Imperial Japanese Navy. You will hear the testimony of the men who witnessed his final moments. And you will understand why Bruno Gaido's story is not just about courage in battle. It is about courage in the face of something far worse. The Japanese destroyer Makigumo was turning toward his position. In Part 1, you watched Bruno Gaido run toward a burning kamikaze and save the USS Enterprise with nothing but a pair of machine guns and raw courage. In Part 2, you watched him help sink the Japanese carrier Kaga at the Battle of Midway, then fight off 6 Zero fighters in a desperate aerial duel. Now you will learn what happened when the Japanese found him. Bruno Gaido was floating in a tiny rubber raft 20 miles from the burning wreckage of the Japanese fleet he had helped destroy. His pilot, Ensign Frank O'Flaherty, was with him. Their aircraft had gone down after running out of fuel. Help had been promised. James McCarthy had noted their position. A rescue ship would be sent. But the Japanese found them first. The destroyer Makigumo was hunting for survivors. Not American survivors. Japanese pilots who had ditched in the water during the battle. But when her lookout spotted 2 American airmen in a yellow life raft, the ship changed course. What happened over the next 11 days would remain secret for 3 years. The Makigumo. The Makigumo was a Yagumo-class destroyer, one of the newest and most powerful in the Japanese Navy. She displaced 2,077 tons. Her crew numbered over 200 men. She was part of the screen protecting the Japanese carriers. Her crew had watched those carriers burn. They had watched the Kaga explode. They had watched the Akagi become an inferno. They had watched the Soryu break apart and sink. They had watched hundreds of their comrades die in flames, screaming, burning, drowning in the fuel-slicked waters of the Pacific. The Battle of Midway was Japan's first major naval defeat of the war. In a single morning, they had lost 4 aircraft carriers. They had lost over 3,000 men. They had lost the initiative in the Pacific. And now, floating in the debris field of that catastrophic defeat, were 2 of the men responsible. The Makigumo altered course. Bruno Gaido and Franco Flaherty were pulled from their raft and brought aboard the Japanese destroyer. They were the first American prisoners taken from the Battle of Midway. They would also be the last. 11 days. For 11 days, O'Flaherty and Gaido were held aboard the Makigumo. The interrogations began immediately. The Japanese wanted to know everything. The strength of the American carrier force. How many ships? How many aircraft? The disposition of the fleet. Where were the other carriers? What were their patrol patterns? The defenses of Midway Island. How many troops? What kind of fortifications? Where were the anti-aircraft batteries? The Japanese had been surprised at Midway. They had not expected 3 American carriers to be waiting for them. They had not expected to lose 4 of their own carriers in a single morning. They needed to understand what had happened, and they believed these 2 prisoners could tell them. According to Japanese records recovered after the war, the interrogators claimed that Gaido provided useful information about Midway's defenses. They claimed he revealed troop strengths and fortification positions. This was almost certainly false. Bruno Gaido had never set foot on Midway Island. He was a carrier-based machinist and gunner. He knew nothing about the island's defenses, troop strengths, or fortifications. Neither did O'Flaherty. Rear Admiral Samuel J. Cox, the director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, later assessed what probably happened. My assessment is that O'Flaherty and Gaido, possibly under torture, gave up plausible but phony information. They told the Japanese what they wanted to hear. They made up details that sounded convincing. They bought time. Everyone who knew Bruno Gaido believed the same thing. He would not have cracked. This was the man who had run toward a kamikaze, the man who had climbed into a parked aircraft to fight a duel with a suicide bomber, the man who had told a nervous pilot, "You got wings, don't you?" Bruno Gaido was not the type to break. But on June 15, 1942, 11 days after the Battle of Midway, the Japanese decided their prisoners were no longer useful. The order. Commander Isamu Fujita was the captain of the Makigumo. He received orders to dispose of the prisoners. The exact wording of those orders has been lost to history, but the meaning was clear. The 2 Americans were to be executed. Fujita faced a choice. He could follow the order, or he could refuse and face the consequences himself. In the Imperial Japanese Navy of 1942, refusing an order was not an option. Officers who disobeyed were court-martialed, dishonored, and sometimes executed themselves. The pressure to conform was absolute. But Fujita did something unexpected. He asked for volunteers. According to Japanese accounts assembled from interrogations of surviving crew members after the war, Fujita gathered his men and asked who would carry out the execution. He did not order anyone specifically. He asked for volunteers. The crew of the Makigumo refused. Not one man stepped forward. Even after watching 3 carriers burn, even after the humiliation of Japan's first major defeat, even after losing friends and comrades in the flames. The sailors of the Makigumo would not volunteer to murder 2 helpless prisoners. No one stepped forward. The execution was postponed. Midnight. But it could not be postponed forever. Later that night, in the midnight hours, a small group of men were ordered, not asked, ordered to carry out the execution. The details of what happened next come from interrogations conducted after the war. American investigators questioned surviving crew members of the Makigumo. They pieced together the final hours of Bruno Gaido's life. O'Flaherty and Gaido were brought up from below decks. They were bound with ropes. Heavy fuel cans, filled with water to make them sink, were tied to their bodies. The two Americans were taken to the side of the ship. Japanese accounts state that both men met their end with stoic and dignified defiance. They did not beg. They did not plead. They faced death the same way Bruno Gaido had faced the kamikaze 4 months earlier, without flinching. Ensign Frank Woodrow O'Flaherty and aviation machinist mate First Class Bruno Peter Gaido were thrown overboard into the Pacific Ocean. They drowned in darkness. Somewhere in the vast waters where their dive bomber had helped destroy the pride of the Japanese Navy, Bruno Gaido sank beneath the waves and disappeared. He was 26 years old. The secret. Bruno Gaido's fate remained unknown for 3 years. On July 4, 1942, he was declared missing in action. The Navy knew his aircraft had gone down. They knew McCarthy had seen him and O'Flaherty climb into their raft. They knew a rescue had been attempted. But the rescue ship had found nothing. No raft, no bodies, no trace. Gaido was presumed dead on June 5, 1943, the first anniversary of Midway. In Milwaukee, his mother Clementina received the telegram that every parent dreaded. Her son was missing. He might be alive. He might be dead. He might be a prisoner. No one knew. She never found out the truth. Clementina Gaido died less than 2 months after Bruno was reported missing. The family later said the stress of not knowing what had happened to her son had killed her. A mother who lost her son. A son who died alone in the dark Pacific waters. The full story did not emerge until 1945. The truth comes out. After Japan's surrender, American investigators gained access to Japanese naval records. They interrogated surviving officers and crew members. They pieced together what had happened to the prisoners taken at Midway. The execution of O'Flaherty and Gaido was classified as a war crime, but there would be no prosecution. Commander Isamu Fujita did not survive the war. Most of the officers responsible for the execution did not survive either, and the Makigumo herself met a fitting end. On February 1, 1943, exactly 1 year to the day after Bruno Gaido saved the USS Enterprise, the Makigumo struck a mine during the evacuation of Guadalcanal. The explosion tore open her hull. She sank in less than 30 minutes. Over 130 of her crew went down with her. Justice, of a sort, had been served. The legacy. Bruno Peter Gaido served in the United States Navy for just 20 months, from October 1940 to June 1942. In that short time, he participated in the first offensive operation of the Pacific War. He saved America's most important aircraft carrier from a kamikaze attack. He helped sink a Japanese carrier at the Battle of Midway. He fought off 6 Zero fighters in aerial combat. And he faced death with dignity and courage. His body was never recovered. His name is inscribed on the Courts of the Missing at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. One of thousands of names representing those who gave their lives in the Pacific and whose remains were never found. In April 1943, Bruno Gaido was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation read, "With heroic and meritorious devotion to duty, he rendered valuable assistance to his pilot by detailing continuous, specific, and comprehensive information concerning the disposition and movements of enemy Japanese units." His courage and cool determination in carrying out this vital task in the face of furious and repeated attacks were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. The citation did not mention how he died. It could not. No one knew yet. The ones he saved. The USS Enterprise survived the war. She fought in almost every major battle of the Pacific. She was damaged multiple times. She was hit by kamikazes. She was struck by bombs. Her crew called her the Lucky E, and later, the Gray Ghost. She earned 20 battle stars, more than any other ship in American history. And she carried over 2,000 men. Every one of those men owed their lives, at least in part, to a machinist who ran toward a burning bomber on February 1st, 1942. Dusty Cleese, the pilot who made his first carrier landings with Gaido in the rear seat, went on to become one of the most decorated aviators of the war. He scored hits on 3 Japanese ships at Midway, all of which sank. He received the Navy Cross. He lived to be 100 years old, passing away in 2016. Before he died, Cleese wrote a memoir called Never Call Me a Hero. In it, he devoted several pages to Bruno Gaido. "You got wings, don't you?" Cleese remembered Gaido saying. That was Bruno Gaido, a young man from Milwaukee who wanted to serve his country, a machinist who kept the dive bombers flying, a gunner who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. But there is one more chapter to the story. In 1996, Bruno Gaido became the first inductee into the Enlisted Combat Aircrew Roll of Honor, established aboard the USS Yorktown Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. No ship has ever been named after him. No movie has told his story. No monument stands in Milwaukee. But his legacy lives on in ways that numbers cannot measure. In Part 4, you will learn what Bruno Gaido's story means today. You will discover how one machinist's suicidal decision changed the way the Navy thinks about courage and initiative. You will hear from the historians who have studied his final days, and you will understand why Bruno Gaido's story is not just about World War II. It is about what ordinary people can do when they decide to act. It is about courage, not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward anyway. Bruno Gaido was afraid. He had to be. No sane person runs toward a kamikaze without fear. But he ran anyway, and that made all the difference. You have followed Bruno Gaido's journey from the beginning. In Part 1, you watched a 25-year-old machinist sprint across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise toward a burning Japanese kamikaze. You saw him climb into a parked dive bomber and open fire at point-blank range. In Part 2, you witnessed the aftermath. Admiral Halsey promoted him on the spot. The entire crew called him a hero. And then you followed him to the Battle of Midway, where he helped sink the carrier Kaga and fought off 6-0 fighters. In Part 3, you learned the terrible truth. The Japanese destroyer Makigumo found Bruno Gaido floating in his life raft. For 11 days, they interrogated him. And on June 15, 1942, they bound him with ropes, tied him to weighted fuel cans, and threw him into the Pacific Ocean. Bruno Gaido died in darkness at the age of 26 after serving in the Navy for just 20 months. But this is not where his story ends. Because the legacy of Bruno Gaido is not measured in the months he served or the medals he received. It is measured in the lives he saved and the lesson he left behind. A lesson that the United States Navy is still teaching today. The ones who remembered. When the war ended in 1945, the men who had served with Bruno Gaido scattered across America. They went home to their families, They built careers. They tried to forget the things they had seen. But they never forgot Bruno Gaido. Norman Kleiss, the pilot who made his first carrier landings with Gaido in the rear seat, went on to become one of the most celebrated aviators of World War II. He scored direct hits on 3 different Japanese ships at the Battle of Midway. All 3 sank. He received the Navy Cross and multiple distinguished flying crosses. After the war, Kleiss became an engineer. He worked on missile programs. He raised a family. He lived a long and full life. But throughout all those years, he carried one memory that never faded. A young machinist, sitting in the rear seat of his dive bomber, refusing to leave, saying 5 words that changed everything. "You got wings, don't you?" Kleiss wrote about Gaido in his memoir, published when he was nearly 100 years old. The book was called Never Call Me a Hero. But there was one man Kleiss believed deserved that title more than himself. "Bruno Gaido was the bravest man I ever knew," Kleiss wrote. "He believed in me before I believed in myself, and he ran toward death when everyone else would have run away." Kleiss died in 2016 at the age of 100, one of the last surviving dive bomber pilots from Midway. But before he passed, he made sure that Bruno Gaido's name would not be forgotten. The Mother Who Never Knew. In Milwaukee, Clementina Gaido received the telegram in the summer of 1942. Missing in action. Those 3 words destroyed her. She did not know that her son had been captured. She did not know about the interrogations aboard the Makigumo. She did not know about the midnight execution, or the weighted fuel cans, or the dark Pacific waters. All she knew was that her boy was gone. Clementina Gaido died less than 2 months after receiving that telegram. The family said it was the stress of not knowing. The uncertainty had broken her heart. She never learned the truth about how Bruno died. She never learned that he had faced his executioners with dignity and courage. She never learned that the Japanese sailors who witnessed his final moments said he did not flinch. A mother who lost her son. A son who died believing no one would ever know his sacrifice. But someone did know. And eventually, the truth came out. The investigation. After Japan surrendered in August 1945, American investigators began piecing together the fates of missing servicemen. One of those investigators was assigned to the Makigumo case. By 1945, the Makigumo had been at the bottom of the ocean for over 2 years, sunk by a mine during the evacuation of Guadalcanal. But some of her crew had survived. They had been transferred to other ships before the sinking. They had been captured when those ships were sunk. They had ended up in American custody. The investigators questioned them. Slowly, the story emerged. The 2 American airmen pulled from the water after Midway. The 11 days of interrogation. The order to dispose of the prisoners. The crew's refusal to volunteer. The midnight execution. The investigators classified it as a war crime. But Commander Isamu Fujita, who had given the order, was dead. The Makigumo had taken him to the bottom. Most of the officers involved had not survived the war. There would be no trial, no punishment, no justice in the conventional sense. But there was something else. The truth. Bruno Gaido's family finally learned what had happened to him. They learned that he had not simply disappeared into the vast Pacific. They learned that he had been a prisoner. They learned that he had faced death with the same courage he had shown when he ran toward the kamikaze. The truth did not bring Bruno back, but it brought closure. The role of honor. For decades after the war, Bruno Gaido remained a footnote in history. He was mentioned in books about the Enterprise. He appeared in accounts of the Battle of Midway. His name was inscribed on the courts of the missing in Honolulu. But he never received the recognition that other heroes received. No ship was named after him. No movie told his story. No monument stood in Milwaukee. Then, in 1996, something changed. The USS Yorktown Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, established the Enlisted Combat Aircrew Roll of Honor. The purpose was to recognize the gunners and radiomen who flew in the rear seats of Navy aircraft. The men who faced the same dangers as the pilots, but rarely received the same recognition. Bruno Gaido was chosen as the first inductee. 54 years after his death, Bruno Gaido finally received the honor he deserved. The ceremony was small. There were no television cameras, no national coverage. Just a group of veterans and historians gathered to remember a young machinist from Milwaukee who had done something extraordinary. But that ceremony mattered. It meant that Bruno Gaido's story would be preserved. It meant that future generations would learn about the man who ran toward the kamikaze. It meant that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. The lesson. What can we learn from Bruno Gaido? He was not a pilot. He was not an officer. He was not trained for the moment that defined his life. He was a machinist who fixed airplane engines. But when the moment came, he acted. He did not wait for orders. He did not ask for permission. He did not calculate the odds or consider the consequences. He saw a threat to his ship and his shipmates, and he ran toward it. This is the lesson that the Navy still teaches today. In a crisis, initiative matters more than rank. Courage matters more than training. Action matters more than authority. Bruno Gaido proved that an ordinary person in an extraordinary moment can change the course of history. The USS Enterprise survived the war because a machinist decided to act. She went on to earn 20 battle stars. She carried over 2,000 men through the most dangerous waters in the Pacific. She became the most decorated ship in American naval history. All because one man refused to wait for someone else to do something. The parallel. Bruno Gaido was not the only ordinary person who changed World War II. Consider Desmond Doss, a combat medic who refused to carry a weapon. He saved 75 men at the Battle of Okinawa, lowering them down a cliff one by one while under Japanese fire. He became the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor. Consider Doris Miller, a mess attendant aboard the USS West Virginia at Pearl Harbor. He had never been trained on anti-aircraft guns, but when the Japanese attacked, he manned a weapon and shot down enemy aircraft. He became one of the first African-American heroes of the war. Consider the Navajo code talkers, Native American Marines who used their language to create an unbreakable code. They were not cryptographers. They were not scientists. They were young men from reservations who found a way to contribute that no one else could. In each case, the pattern is the same. An ordinary person, an extraordinary moment, a decision to act. Bruno Gaido fits this pattern perfectly. He was not special. He was not chosen. He was just a machinist who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time, and he chose to run toward the danger. The detail no one knows. There is one more thing about Bruno Gaido that most people do not know. Remember the pilot who made his first carrier landings with Gaido in the rear seat? Norman Kleiss, who went on to become one of the most decorated aviators of Midway? Kleiss flew his dive bomber against 3 different Japanese ships that day. The carrier Kaga, the cruiser Mikuma, and another target that has been lost to history. All 3 ships sank. But here is what makes this significant. If Bruno Gaido had not climbed into that aircraft during Kleist's qualification flight in June 1941, Kleist might never have become the pilot he became. By his own admission, Gaido's confidence transformed his mindset. Gaido believed in him before he believed in himself. That belief carried Kleist through training. It carried him through Pearl Harbor. It carried him to Midway, where he became the only pilot to score direct hits on 3 different Japanese ships. Bruno Gaido saved the Enterprise in February 1942, but in a very real sense, he also contributed to the victory at Midway 4 months later, even though he was not there for the crucial dive that sank the carriers. His influence lived on through the pilots he believed in. The final twist. And here is the twist that no one expected. The Makigumo, the ship that executed Bruno Gaido, sank on February 1, 1943. Exactly 1 year to the day after Bruno Gaido saved the USS Enterprise from the kamikaze attack. February 1, 1942, Bruno Gaido runs toward a burning bomber and saves 2,000 American lives. February 1, 1943, the ship that murdered him strikes a mine and goes down with over 130 of her crew. Some would call this coincidence. Others would call it fate. Others still would call it justice. Whatever you call it, the symmetry is undeniable. The Pacific Ocean claimed the Makigumo on the anniversary of Bruno Gaido's greatest triumph, as if the sea itself remembered what had been done to him. The conclusion. From a machinist who fixed airplane engines to a legend who saved a carrier, Bruno Peter Gaido served in the United States Navy for 20 months. In that time, he participated in the first offensive raid of the Pacific War. He saved America's most important aircraft carrier from a kamikaze attack. He helped sink a Japanese carrier at Midway. He fought off 6 Zero fighters in aerial combat. And he faced execution with the same courage he showed when he ran toward death on the flight deck of the Enterprise. He was 26 years old when he died. His body was never recovered. His name is inscribed on a wall in Honolulu, one among thousands. But his story endures. Because Bruno Gaido proved something that every generation needs to remember. You do not have to be special to do something extraordinary. You do not have to be trained. You do not have to be chosen. You just have to act. When the moment comes, when everyone else is frozen, when the danger is bearing down and there is no time to think, what you do in that instant defines who you are. Bruno Gaido ran toward the fire, and that made all the difference. If you know a story like this, a story of an ordinary person who did something extraordinary, share it in the comments. These stories deserve to be told. This is just one of hundreds of forgotten heroes from World War II, men and women who changed history and were never properly recognized. Subscribe to discover more. And remember what Bruno Gaido taught us. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is being afraid and jumping anyway. You got wings, don't you? Now fly.